Good afternoon. I'm Jane Harmon, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., former member of Congress, where I represented parts of Los Angeles, which I called, and still do, North Mexico. A huge Mexican influence there, all for the good, and a lot of time growing up to fall in love with Mexico, which I still am. This event is organized by the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute and the Mexico Council on Foreign Relations. I'm excited to welcome U.S. Ambassador to Mexico, Christopher Landau, who will share his insights on U.S.-Mexico cooperation during the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. We have a huge number of people listening in, and some are trying to get on the airwaves, or I guess the Zoom waves, Zoom in, and we hope you'll be able to get in because this is yet another event by our Mexico Institute that is attracting a huge audience. Ambassador Landau is the son of the late George W. Landau, who served as U.S. Ambassador to 3 countries, Paraguay, Chile, and Venezuela. I say that not to overshadow our special guest, but to point out that Latin America has played a major role in this Ambassador Landau's childhood. That gives him extra qualifications on top of all the ordinary garden variety qualifications. Duncan Wood, the director of our Mexico Institute and the moderator of today's discussion, tells me that Ambassador Landau's Spanish still has a notable Paraguayan accent. Go figure, whatever that may mean, but that his Mexican accent is getting stronger by the day. Duncan, your British accent is still strong, so I'm not exactly sure what your observation means, in fact. But Ambassador Landau arrived in Mexico at a crucial time. The surge of Central American migration last year brought the need for unprecedented coordination between the U.S. and Mexico on border security. Thankfully, we have risen to the challenge and made great progress in the way of government cooperation. That's a very good thing. And it's thanks in no small part to the ambassador's efforts. The COVID-19 epidemic and pandemic, of course, has brought new and very different challenges. From ensuring the safety of Americans in Mexico to coordinating the partial closing of the U.S.-Mexico border, it's safe to say that the ambassador has had his hands full in recent weeks. So we are extraordinarily grateful that he has agreed to talk to us today. Ambassador, as I'm sure you know, our Mexico Institute is the go-to source for analysis on the U.S.-Mexico relationship. So I feel comfortable leaving you in the very capable hands of Duncan Wood for this interview. I'm not leaving you. I will be here watching, but Duncan will be the one to carry out the interview. Special thanks to Duncan and his team for their hard work in excellent programming in these unusual times. Please join me in welcoming the director of our first-in-class Mexico Institute, Duncan Wood.
Thank you, Jane, for your kind words and also your leadership during this difficult time. It's been extraordinary to watch how the Wilson Center has come up with such dynamic and relevant programming, seemingly on a not just a daily basis, but a couple of times a day. And thank you for playing a role in so many of those events. I'd like to thank our partner institution, COMEXI, the Mexican Council on Foreign Affairs. We're going to be hearing from its president, Luis Rubio, who will give some closing comments at the end of this event. And Luis Rubio, of course, is also a global fellow with the Mexico Institute and a member of our board. Thank you, Ambassador Landau, for being here. It's been wonderful to see how you have worked as an ambassador during these times. You really took the bull by the horns when you first landed in Mexico and embraced Mexican culture. And I know that you're dearly loved by so many people in Mexico because of that. I'm going to give you a little bit of a more formal introduction in a second. Let me also thank our corporate sponsors. We have board members from many different sectors at the Mexico Institute. We're grateful to all of them for their support, but I'd like to especially point out the board members from the pharmaceutical and health sector who support our work, and in particular on public health cooperation between Mexico and the United States, Pharma, Pfizer, Amgen, and Gilead. Thanks to all of them for their inputs on our public health, which actually helped us to put together a publication recently titled Beyond Pandemics, U.S.-Mexico Cooperation on Public Health, that I co-authored with Andrew Rudman. And there are some ideas in there for taking public health cooperation forward after this pandemic is over. But I'd like to give a more formal introduction to Ambassador Christopher Landau. And Ambassador Landau was born in Madrid, one of my favorite cities. And now he gets to live in my favorite city, Mexico City, because, I mean, I have no doubt it's the most fun city in the world. But of course, you, as Jane mentioned, you spent a lot of your childhood in Paraguay. That's where you learned your fluent Spanish. But you came back to the United States, went to school in Boston. You went to Harvard for both your undergraduate and your graduate work, and got a JD, summa cum laude, from Harvard. Ambassador Landau was a very, very successful lawyer before he came to be ambassador in Mexico, and argued 9 cases before the Supreme Court. That's something extraordinary. And he has been U.S. ambassador to Mexico since August of last year. As many people who are watching this webcast know, there was a significant gap before Ambassador Landau was able to go down to Mexico. And it was really felt, I think, that we needed an ambassador in place. And so everybody watched with great interest to see who the choice would be from the Trump administration. And we're so glad that you were nominated and accepted to go down to Mexico City. As I said earlier on, you've not only embraced the country and its culture, but you really have been embraced by the country. And I think that's a testament to you as a human being and as a skilled diplomat. But it also shows very much the human side of diplomacy, which sometimes we forget about. So
I've already accepted your invitation to do this thing. You don't have to butter me up now.
Thank you so much for being here. I would like to turn the microphone over to you for some opening comments. Obviously, this has been a very complex and complicated time over the past couple of months. But perhaps you'd like to begin with some reflections on what you found when you first got down to Mexico, how you perceived the bilateral relationship before the pandemic, and then to talk a little bit about sort of the successes and the challenges of bilateral cooperation during the pandemic. I will leave the microphone open for you right now, and then come back to question you on some more specific details when you're done. So, Ambassador Landau, over to you.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much to you, Duncan, and to you, Jane, for those introductions. Let me just start out by saying that I'm honored and delighted to be here today at this forum sponsored by not only the Wilson Center, for which I have great respect, but also by COMEXI, an institution here in Mexico that I have really learned to cherish and to call on for very unfailingly wise advice. So I feel like, this is actually my first kind of public give and take since the pandemic started, and I can't think of a better forum than this. I say that I made the transition last year from being a lawyer to being a diplomat, and I can't think of a much more dramatic change. I specialized in appellate litigation, so mostly taking cases at the Court of Appeals, very focused on writing briefs, presenting oral arguments in different courts, but it was a very academic corner of the law where I had a lot of time to think, to write, to read, all of which I have done very little of since I arrived in Mexico as ambassador. My days now are mostly talking to people, meetings, and it's wonderful to work those different muscles. But I want to just emphasize that I really value institutions like the Wilson Institute, particularly the Wilson Center, the Mexico Institute within the Wilson Center, and COMEXI, folks that actually have the time and the passion to do the deep digging, the writing, the reading that needs to be done, that policymakers, in my position, we just don't have the time to do that. And so, I miss those days. But I'm very grateful that there are other people who are still doing those kind of things. And so, again, I just want to take my hats off to both Wilson Center and to COMEXI. Let me just kind of address Duncan's point, which is, I always knew that going as ambassador to Mexico was not going to be a, champagne and cocktail party kind of embassy. This is not Luxembourg. There are very, very, and nothing against Luxembourg. I don't know if there's any Luxembourgeois people here, but oh, I have one right here in my room. Okay, there's one in every crowd. But this is a very complicated and critically important relationship for both countries. One of the reasons I really wanted this job was that I firmly believe that neither of our countries can really have success in its own domestic agenda without getting the relationship with the other country right. And so, I came down here very much focused on three key areas, which are immigration, and as Duncan mentioned briefly, or maybe it was Jane said, if you think back to last year, it's funny how, the crisis of the day kind of changes, and the pandemic has kind of minimized everything else. But we were facing a very serious crisis at our southern border last year, and so that was kind of at the top of the agenda. Also, there's the constant security issue with Mexico, which, from the U.S. perspective is basically about narcotics interdiction. From the Mexican perspective, entails a far broader patchwork of, corruption, insecurity within Mexico in general, crime in Mexico, violence. So there's lots of aspects of that problem, and it's proven to be very difficult over the decades. And then economic issues. The USMCA was still up in the air last year. And frankly, it was somewhat up in the air until the moment when all of a sudden it all kind of came into place back in December. But there were some pretty tense moments there going down to the wire. And the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico, the economic relationship, I'm sure that everybody on this call appreciates, is so important to both countries that we were each other's largest trading partner in goods last year. And so that part of the relationship is really critical to get right. And so, my days in the 9 months that I've been here up to now, or let's say in the 7 or 8 months that I was here before the pandemic, I would kind of vary on any given day. I might be focused on one or the other or multiple of those issues at once, but those were kind of my bread and butter issues. When the pandemic kind of came along in the beginning of or middle of March, obviously that became the issue, how we respond to that. And all the other issues really had to be looked at through the pandemic lens. And I think as we can discuss in a moment how the pandemic has really affected all of those other issues. But, suddenly what seemed like a very complicated docket full of high priority issues, it's amazing how a crisis like the pandemic, kind of an existential crisis, kind of focuses the mind and clears away a lot of the cobwebs. Those other issues haven't really gone away, but now we have to kind of come up with a new normal, at least during the pandemic, and then looking towards a post-pandemic future. I'll say that, we're working in general very collaboratively with the Mexicans. I mean, we both have an interest in reducing the infections in both our countries, given just the huge volume of people that cross over our shared border. You can't really have a healthy Mexico without a healthy United States, and vice versa. And so we've been working with Mexico to try to support their health systems. We've both at the governmental level, where we've given them some support. And obviously, Mexico's is a country that has its own money to buy medical supplies on the international market, and they've been doing that. But we've been providing them with support and assistance where we can. And U.S. companies have also really stepped up to the plate in the private sector. They just worked with some Mexican companies in funding a big COVID-19 temporary hospital here in Mexico City. I was very proud to see that, and I've been tweeting about it. And then we've seen, General Motors, for example, had turned over its factory in Toluca to making face masks. And, you know, I love highlighting that kind of stuff because I think that shows, you know, the depth of the crisis, or the breadth of cooperation in a time of crisis. You know, I'd say there have been some areas that have gone fairly smoothly in the crisis. I think, you know, we can get more into this in a moment with Duncan, but, you know, the way that we kind of handled the border itself in the early days of the crisis back in March, I consider to be a real success story. It's one of those kind of things that, you know, you don't get headlines out of doing something successfully. You know, basically people are just, you can only kind of get in trouble if it blows up in your face. But if everything goes smoothly, then it doesn't become a story at all. And I think that's a little bit what happened on the border. It's kind of the story that wasn't. But I, you know, I'm very proud of that. And I think some of my most you know, tricky moments as ambassador were, you know, those days in March, in mid-March, when we kind of moved to this new paradigm of how we're going to deal with stuff in the pandemic, and how we addressed, you know, keeping the border open to commerce in this crisis and not making the economic situation in both countries worse. You know, I'd say the biggest frustration for me, and the thing that this pandemic has laid bare, is that we have to do more on the economic front to talk about cooperation on things like essential industries in times of crisis. That has been just a sore area from the beginning. I'm a very frank person, and I talk frankly about things, and you know, again, I'm not blaming any particular person or government or anything. I just think, you know, none of the countries really proceeded in a coordinated fashion. And that's understandable when you have a sudden crisis like this, and particularly when you have federal republics with significant authority and responsibility at the state and local levels. You know, these kind of things don't happen seamlessly. But I think, you know, you can certainly have procedures in place that will allow for more institutionalized, ongoing discussions of that issue. And I think, you know, to me, you know, one of the really important things here is to talk about lessons learned and things we can go forward. I'm sure the Wilson Center and the Mexico Institute will be focusing on these issues as we move forward. And I certainly look forward to seeing what they have to say about this, because I am very open to lessons learned, and certainly hearing about different people's experiences, things that those of you on the call, I mean, presumably all of you are on this call because you have interest in the U.S.-Mexico relationship in the time of pandemic, and I'm very interested to hear all of your perspectives on, you know, things that we can do better now, frankly, and moving forward. So, you know, I think, again, there are some things I think that we've done well, like in the context of we've significantly reduced our in-staff presence at the embassy, as you might expect, and at the consulates when the health crisis really started to heat up in mid-March. And but so we went to about 10% working at the office at that time, to really keep open the essential services and emergency services. And I think by and large, my perception, again, I'm open to hearing from other folks who are the users of our services, is that we have managed to keep our heads above water and kind of keep the trains running, if not exactly on time, at least, you know, on the track, particularly in an area which I can get into a little bit more later, like agricultural workers that are, you know, they need those H-2A visas. That is such a critical component really for both countries' economy, and we've managed to keep that going. So again, I think there's a lot of success stories here, as well, frankly, as a lot of frustration about the lack of coordination on other things like essential industries. So, you know, I think it's kind of a mixed bag overall, but I want to accentuate the positive, and acknowledge the negative. I mean, I'm certainly, as I said, open to, hearing different perspectives. So, I am, very much a believer, just to kind of talk a little bit about, the economic situation. I think there are certainly very, not only legitimate, but compelling health interests at stake on both sides of the border. And, the key is to come up with a way to protect worker health, without, completely stopping economic activity. I think it's possible to walk and chew gum at the same time. So I think and I think we're seeing that in places like China and Europe. I mean, Mexico and the United States, particularly Mexico, has the advantage of being kind of at the end of the worldwide curve of this. So there's a lot of lessons learned from other parts of the world. And I'm always very eager to hear what companies who operate in those other parts of the world have to say. So again, I think I'll wrap it up there, and maybe we can go to some more targeted questions. But let me just reiterate again that I feel very honored to have this platform today to speak with you. And, I look forward to answering your questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. We're getting some questions coming in already. For those of you who want to ask questions, then please send an email to mexico@wilsoncenter.org or to the Mexico Institute's Twitter feed at Mexico Institute. But let me begin, Ambassador, by talking about one case in particular, and that is the closing of the partial closing, rather, of the U.S.-Mexico border that occurred. I think that a lot of us, observers, analysts, were worried that this would cause chaos on the border if it wasn't done in the right way. But what we actually saw was in my humble opinion, a great success of coordination between Mexico and the United States in the way that the border was closed to make sure that the goods and services and people that need to keep crossing the border could do so, whilst at the same time mitigating the risk. And I know that something very, very similar happened on the northern border with Canada. But I wonder, could you tell us just a little bit about the dynamics of that process? How did it actually happen? What was the interaction between the two governments that enabled the partial closing of the border to be so coordinated and successful?
Thank you, Duncan. I think that those were maybe the most dramatic moments of my tenure here in Mexico so far. And I think one of the things we have to remember is that everything got very real very suddenly in mid-March. I actually had a normal schedule. I was talking to a group of about 400 people. I know that on March 11th, that week up to I remember it ended on Friday the 13th, maybe somewhat ominously that week. And, I still had a normal schedule that week. One of the tricky things about this virus is that it hit different countries at different times. So the US was already and Canada were kind of on different tracks than Mexico. And so as, community infection was starting to be noticed in the United States, there really were just the very first cases here in Mexico. So there's always been about a 3-week or so time lag between Mexico and the United States that I think it's important to keep in mind, that this didn't hit each of our countries at exactly the same moment. So, it takes a while for people to kind of realize, wow, we might need to really take some very dramatic steps here. I'm glad you raised Canada, because Canada was actually, and I don't know that this is particularly been focused on, was really the driver of this. I think the United States had more cases than other countries in North America at this time in early March. I think Canada was interested in restricting the flow across its border with the United States, the northern border. And then, it's kind of funny how things have ripple effects. The United States couldn't very well announce, restrictions on its northern border. And the obvious question was, well, what are you doing on your southern border? So it kind of had to be done in a coordinated way. The United States and Canada had been in discussions, because again, the virus was more advanced there. So they had kind of developed this essential visits paradigm in the U.S.-Canadian discussions. And then I think after that had been going on for several days, and it looked like an announcement was imminent, I think that's when somebody says, well, we got to also kind of roll in the southern border to this. And, again, at that point here in Mexico, we were just starting to get the first cases. They were quite specific and targeted. There were maybe people who'd been in Vail or in Europe or in very specific places there, but there wasn't really a sense that it was so dramatic as to taking that kind of a step. I think the Mexicans were very concerned that the United States, because of what it was doing with Canada, might close the border. And I think it was very important to everybody involved. They made this very clear to me, and I thought it was a very fair point, that in a sense, it doesn't help any of us to close the border. That the question is always keeping the border open for essential activities. It's a little bit of a glass half full, glass half empty kind of issue. But so, it was very important, I think, to message this as, keeping the border open to commerce, which there was really never any discussion on anybody's part, to close commerce. I think that just shows how far advanced we are in economic integration. And so really it was a question of taking the model that the US and Canada had worked out and, bringing it to Mexico. But again, as you said, this is such a complex border that, the thought is, if you really wanted to figure out how are we going to, limit the border, you could probably have a commission, a working group talking about that for 6 months, right? I mean, we basically had to do this in 24 hours in that middle week of March. And, I think that everybody understood that it was much better to do any of these things on a multilateral basis, or at least a bilateral basis between the US and Canada, and a bilateral basis between the US and Mexico, for a whole host of reasons. And so, we went into the Mexican government. We had some very good conversations. I think they understood where we were coming from on that, and I think we understood where they were coming from. And so I think that was one, as you said, I think I was worried, frankly, that the narrative would be, chaos on the border, because it doesn't take much to create chaos on the border. I mean, you probably, you get a dead deer by the side of the highway and it can back up the trucks for like 12 hours going in. So, I was quite concerned that the essential, non-essential line would be difficult to apply in practice. Frankly, as a lawyer, maybe I'm trained to kind of think of all the difficult hypotheticals and the gray area. But, I think people in all three countries, took a very common sense approach to this. And it was kind of funny, the day after this went into effect, there was a story in one of the Mexican papers, like chaos at the border. And it showed a big backup of cars. I don't know if that was like a file photo that they had or something like that of the border, because another paper had, empty gatehouses at the border there, empty border crossing checks. And so I tweeted kind of, saying like, okay, guys, I know you love your narrative of chaos on the border, but like cut that narrative. It's actually been remarkably successful. And, it's proven to be that way. I have to say, I mean, it's one of these things as a policymaker, you do the best you can, and then you kind of just, hope that it works out. And this is one of those cases where I think it really did. And I think what's really remarkable is that the commerce in trucks and in, the real commercial activity, the people who work on either side of the border, that all continued fine. And I think everybody just kind of got it. And so, I think, it could have really gone ugly, but I just think everybody realized, particularly in the time of pandemic, that this wasn't a joke. It wasn't, politically motivated by one country or other. Everybody was kind of rowing in the same direction, and it worked.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's a stunning example of how positive the relationship has been, and particularly the relationship that the State Department, the embassy, and yourself in particular built up with Canciller Ebrard, who I think has done just such a stunning job of communicating with the U.S. government and understanding the needs on both sides of the border.
He's been a great partner, and I think he knows, what's most important in this business I've come to see is, being able to put yourself in the other person's shoes and really understand, what are the constraints under which that person is operating. And so you don't spend a lot of time on, stuff that the other side couldn't possibly accept. I think he knows pretty well the constraints under which I'm operating. I understand the constraints under which he's operating. And so, we kind of get right to the point. And again, but there's a lot of people involved in this. I mean, I think the Border Patrol did a very good job, the CBP, at the actual ports of entry in terms of implementing this policy, without, obviously this kind of came up almost overnight. I mean, I think this all kind of came up from beginning to end in less than 48 hours. And so when you think about it, particularly in that context, a lot could have gone wrong. But I think that relationship is very important between and Marcelo Ebrard, the foreign minister, is a key player and an excellent partner. And again, I think both presidents want to have a good relationship with the other country, notwithstanding what a lot of people think and thought when they came in. I think both of them value this relationship, and it paid off dividends that night and when those decisions were made.
Let me take you to a slightly more difficult issue, though, and the one that you've already brought up, and that is, of course, the question of supply chains, reactivating parts of the Mexican economy so that components can flow back across the border to the United States. And you've already pointed out, obviously, this is a question not just of the economy, but of public health. And we know that reopening factories does put some people at risk. But I wonder if you could talk about, the progress that you're making, or the problems that you're facing on that issue, because despite the positive relationship, of course, this is a very difficult issue to handle, and it's received a lot of attention now in the press here in the United States.
Yeah.
And so I just wonder if you could walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, look, I think just to put everything in context, and you all know this better than I do, but we are now the beneficiaries of basically 30 years of work by people on this call, as well as other people, to really push ahead North American economic integration and use the relative advantages of each of our countries to improve the wealth of the region as a whole. I frankly am concerned about North American supply chains. I mean, it's a very intricate system where so many companies in the States, not only the big ones like GM and Ford, but little companies that make lawn blowers or alarm systems have certain components made in Mexico. The Mexican government, President Lopez Obrador was kind of criticized in March. And again, everybody has to keep in mind that the pandemic hit here several weeks later than it hit the United States and Europe. And so he was being criticized for kind of going out and not, doing enough, going out to his rallies, high-fiving people, kissing babies. But at the end of March, he put the health ministry here in control of defining the essential industries, basically gave them the authority to stop all non-essential industries in the country and put that implementation in the hands primarily of the health ministry. As might be expected, I think this was again done in a pretty compressed timetable. They came up with a pretty narrow list of what our industries are essential. Basically, health, security, just in terms of private security and police and all that, and then food chains. So very minimal. I think we in the United States came up with some CISA guidelines that they were guidelines at the federal level. They've been implemented to one extent or another in the states, and I think Canada also, my understanding is, had something very similar to those CISA guidelines. Those are substantially more expansive on essential industries than the Mexican ones. And I have to say, I think from the beginning, I was concerned that there was no mechanism in Mexico or in the United States really or really in Mexico, I guess, for this point, to coordinate with the United States on how you deal with these international supply chains and these differences in the definitions of essential industries. So far, we have been working kind of on an ad hoc basis with American companies. If we get word that an American company says, look, we're allowed to be open in the United States, but we can't open in Mexico, and our plants in the United States are going to have to shut down if we don't get our supplies from Mexico, we've been able to work with the Mexican government, both at the federal and state level, to try to get exemptions and to work it out. Yeah. But there has never been in Mexico in this crisis a kind of formal procedure for companies to petition, to the Mexican government. We need to be reopened to supply this, supply chain. I think it's going to be really important as we come out of this and look to the future to have some kind of a mechanism in place, so that we can do those things. It's very hard to do that once you're in the middle of the crisis. But we are still in the middle of that. I just got off a phone call a few minutes ago about the opening of the automotive sector, which now looks like in the States it will happen May 18th. And we're still working closely with the Mexicans because, again, it helps both our countries. Nobody wants to inflict unnecessary harm on their own country's economy or on these North American supply chains. But it also has to be done in a way that takes into account very legitimate health concerns. So, this has been, I think, a very recurring issue. I suspect lots of people on this call have heard about this or may even be involved in this. And it's been probably my bread and butter over the past 6 weeks has been trying to deal with these kind of things. Again, kind of on a piecemeal basis, which is not ideal. And so I certainly hope that we come up with a mechanism that it would at least would allow there to be a established framework for coordination and discussion, in the future on these kind of things.
Thank you. And now, changing perspective, just to be a little bit more forward-looking, and you'd suggested earlier on that when we get beyond this, there will be an opportunity to reflect and to review how things went. You suggested that we need to have some common definitions of what is an essential industry. And certainly, I think that as we look at the institutionalized mechanisms that exist, the North American Plan for Animal and Pandemic Influenza, for example, the NAPAPI, in there are a lot of different ideas about exchanging information, about stockpiling medicine and essential supplies, for example. But I think that document was written before we had a real understanding of how the integrated economy could be disruptive. So it would be good to go back to that and to include those conversations. And certainly that's part of the work that we'll be doing here at the Mexico Institute. But I was wondering, and I know you're not a public health expert, but it seems to me that this is the perfect excuse now to
Aren't
make public health
experts now? Can't we all talk about flattening the curve? And you think I was a virologist sometimes the way I'm going on. Usually the passion with which I can talk about that can be inversely proportional to my actual knowledge of a subject. So be careful with this.
No, all I was going to say was I think that there is a real opportunity now to make public health an issue in the bilateral relationship in a very positive way. Whether it's about conducting, exchanging information and statistics, very, very important. And we've seen some important stories in the press today about the need for more reliable data in Mexico.
Look, I think this is true across our own country. I mean, I think, people are, counting, what is a COVID death in one way in one place and not a COVID death in another way. I mean, I think this has brought up a lot of inconsistencies, and maybe it's a little bit like after 9/11 when they kind of realized that, the first responders here were not able to talk to the first responders there. We need a common language to deal with these kind of things. And we should kind of agree. Again, even within our own country, in the United States, we have a federal system, so you can have 50 different standards for how to do these things. But I agree with you. I mean, I think, NAPAPI is a good existing framework. It's a pretty limited framework. And just for those of you who aren't that familiar, it doesn't necessarily roll off the tongue. NAPAPI is the North American Plan for Animal and Pandemic Influenza. It was set up in the early 2000s when there was a couple of pandemics, and obviously, being neighbors with a 2,000-mile border, you can't really have any health outbreak in either country is going to affect the other, and really across North America. So I think it's a very positive mechanism. I think, though, it's probably more helpful between times of crisis. I mean, once you're in the crisis, everybody is too busy dealing with the immediate fire in their own house to be, spending a lot of time talking about this. It's just, it's one of these, kind of truisms. And so I think you have to have these mechanisms set up in advance, because it's very hard, you can't really set them up on the fly. And, I think you've obviously, you're more familiar with some of the NAPAPI issues than I am, Duncan, but I think, I'm hoping that we can, again, try to coordinate and align our, at least, definitions with Mexico more, and how we, work to share information, and that. I think, we CDC, I think, has earmarked $3 million for technical assistance for Mexico. That's for, data collection, serological testing, lots of things like that. But I think there's still a long way to go on even on the public health front, where we already had something. But again, I think that goes well beyond public health to include things like, how do we preserve our supply chains in times of crisis? How do we, if you don't have that mechanism set up beforehand, you're not going to set it up in the middle of the crisis. Yeah. We're seeing that now.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we have learned throughout this this pandemic is that communication matters a great deal between nations. And it would be great if we had stronger ties between the health ministries in both countries, and the ability to talk about issues like getting drugs to market. Because one of the issues we're going to face is, when eventually we have a vaccine, how do we get the necessary permits to get that? And that should apply to lots of things, in my opinion.
Yep.
I wanted to sort of now open up to the questions that we're receiving from the audience.
Sure.
And the first question that we have is actually from Luis Tellez, who writes, Mr. Ambassador, as co-chair of the Mexico Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center, I want to thank you for your support, attending our meetings and hosting our board members, among others. And then he says, relating to the pandemic, I want to raise an issue. The Mexico grid operator, SENACE, established a directive which leaves clean energy plants, that prevents new clean energy plants from operating. Several of these plants have been sponsored and financed by US companies. I suppose this is an issue which will create a response from the US government. What is your view?
We have had some concerns as a government about what is happening in the Mexican energy sector for some time now. I don't think that is it should come as a surprise to anyone. The gas pipelines issue recently, and obviously it is up to Mexico to, as a sovereign country, to set the rules of the road when it comes to any domestic policy, including its energy policy. Our message has always been that once you set the rules of the road, however you set them, whatever the rules are, when private companies then come in and invest under those rules, that you have to respect the existing rules. You can't keep changing them. And I think that has been a source of concern for us. And, we are certainly in communication with the Mexican government about, our concerns in the energy sector. I think, look, one of the things about COVID is that it is wreaking such incredible economic devastation in both countries. And I am very hopeful, as our president said, that we can rebound quickly. And I'm certainly hopeful that Mexico can rebound quickly. I always say, my job as American ambassador to Mexico should be pretty easy, because there's so many win-win opportunities. I mean, it is in our national interest to have a prosperous Mexico for a whole host of reasons that everybody knows. But so I actually wish Mexico really well. This is not a zero-sum game where, Mexico doing well somehow hurts us. Mexico doing well benefits us. So we're in this together. And, I certainly, I think both our countries are going to have to figure out in the post-COVID world, and who knows, the post-COVID world isn't going to just pop up overnight. There's not going to be one day when all of a sudden the virus is gone. I mean, this is probably going to be a period of months where we're kind of working our way towards establishing new ways of working, and but I think the economic consequences are probably more dramatic than any of us kind of could consider possible in such a short period of time. So I am hoping that that Mexico and the private sector from the United States will be able to recognize all the win-win possibilities that there are out there, because I don't think anybody has time, the luxury in this economic crisis for having disputes. I think we got to kind of quickly identify ways in which we can actually get money flowing again in both our economies. And I think I have a hard time seeing a scenario for Mexican economic recovery that doesn't include some kind of attractiveness to foreign investment. And investment will go where it is welcomed. And if Mexico, I am very hopeful that they will welcome foreign investment and recognize that benefits them and is not any kind of exploitation of them, but it's a mutual benefit. And I think that is particularly important in the energy sector, which is in a sense the basis of all economic activity. You can't really have any factory anywhere that you can count on if you don't have reliable and inexpensive energy. And so again, I am hopeful that we come out of this and we can kind of, maybe just kind of get real very quickly in terms of projects that will help people really advance.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'd like to turn over to Jane Harman, who's back with us. Well, she was there the whole time, but back with us to ask a question right now. Jane.
Thank you. I think this session is very interesting, and I learned that my good friend Luis Rubio is going to make some comments a bit later. So hello, Luis. I can see you on my screen. It's very nice to see you, and it's wonderful always to partner with you. Ambassador Landau, I learned we went to the same law school. I call myself a recovering lawyer and a recovering politician, so that's two so far. And I am enjoying life, reading books and thinking deep thoughts at the Wilson Center and hoping to make some difference. Here's my question. Yesterday, I think it was yesterday in the Washington Post, big front page story about Latinos most impacted, this is a US story, by COVID-19. I don't know, I'm assuming that's accurate. Papers before that had talked about African Americans, but yesterday the Post said Latinos. You have used this forum, and I think wisely, to talk to an audience here about how you feel. You're obviously very bullish about U.S.-Mexico relations, and not every Latino is of Mexican origin. Got that. But I just wanted to give you a minute to address this, because possibly a lot of these folks, assuming this is accurate, are involved in the U.S.-Mexico supply chain.
Right. Well, look, I think as you kind of pointed out, Latinos in the United States come in many, there are many different strains in that community from different countries. The Mexicans, there's some that have been in our country for, the ones of Mexican ancestry, I should say. There's some who've been in our country for centuries, far longer than my family, certainly. There are others who are new arrivals. And I think a crisis like this focuses the mind. And I think one of the things that is interesting is that, one of the first priorities is to make sure that we have the agricultural workers in the United States who are really, I've said from the beginning, critical to our national security. And I have directed, as our embassy kind of went to a skeletal staff in mid-March, that our consular operations prioritize the processing of these H-2A agricultural workers who are, that coming from California, that they're critical to our own food supply. I very much hope that we can come up with programs that recognize that safe, legal, and orderly immigration is in the interests of both countries. I have been a big fan all along of trying to come up with successors to the old bracero programs from the 50s, which I think were very successful in meeting demands for labor in our country and employing Mexicans. And I think I very much would like to come up with ways to create more possibilities for again, legal and orderly work in the United States. But I think a crisis like this, you have to recognize the importance of Latinos in our economy and in our society and culture. One of the things that I learned when I went through my confirmation hearings last year is that about 35 million Americans, maybe 1 out of 10 Americans, is of Mexican ancestry. And so, the ties between our countries, we talk about economic ties, but there's also very strong blood, family, cultural ties. And, I think it is very important to get this relationship with Mexico right. And certainly, the Latinos in the United States, particularly those of Mexican ancestry, I think are a very important part of our country, what makes our country strong. And, I hope that, we can come out of this. And again, I think there'll be kind of a pre-COVID world and a post-COVID world. And I certainly hope that, in the post-COVID world, there will be real appreciation for the importance of our ties with Mexico and those of Mexican ancestry in our own country. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I've got two. I want to make sure that we have some time for Luis Rubio to give some closing remarks here. But I've got two quick fire questions for you, Ambassador. One of which is from Mary Beth Sheridan of the Washington Post. How has the pandemic slowed cooperation on anti-narcotics efforts? And secondly, it's about the relations with the private sector. There's no doubt that the relations with the private sector in Mexico have changed. In your conversations with the Mexican government stakeholders, do you get a sense that they understand that the private sector is concerned?
Yeah, first dealing on the anti-narcotics, I mean, just as viruses don't respect borders, the narcos don't necessarily respect borders or viruses. And so there has been a continued cooperation on narcotics. There have been several, significant seizures in the past few weeks. I mean, obviously it's a little bit, everybody's being forced to balance a lot on their plate right now. And there've been, it is certainly more logistically complicated to have units going out because you don't want to have as many people together. But let me just make very clear that those efforts have not stopped. And just as the efforts in our country to control the illegal flow of guns and money, which is a big priority of mine, into Mexico have not stopped. And we've had some successful seizures of arms that were southbound. President Trump and President Lopez Obrador talked a few weeks ago, and President Lopez Obrador was, I think, very proudly talking about how the Mexican authorities had found a tunnel in the Tijuana area that was full of drugs and also arms coming the other direction. So, it's certainly been more complicated, just as anything it has gotten more complicated, but it certainly has not stopped. On the private sector question, look, Mexico, there are different private sectors, and the Mexican private sector is very well represented. They have their private sector organizations that they have, I think, had their differences with the current administration here. I don't think that's any big secret. Again, we want a prosperous neighbor. And so, my job is to certainly represent, or part of my job is to represent the interests of the private sector in the United States. I mean, unlike some other countries in the world, we're primarily a private sector driven economy. And so, I part of my job is just to represent the interests of American companies. Again, I find that pretty easy because I think that for any one of these people who want to invest down here, there's a great win-win story. And they're obviously investing under the terms and conditions set by the Mexican government. It's free the Mexican government is free to put whatever conditions it wants on private investment, and then a private investor is certainly free to decide whether it's worth his or her while to make that investment or not. The one thing, as I said before, that really concerns me is when people try to change the terms of a deal that was already set and agreed upon. I think that just destabilizes. Investors and businesses need certainty, and so I think if the Mexican government wants growth and investment and wants money to come into the country, it has to be able to provide certainty to investors. And so, that has been something that I'm very interested in. But I don't think that Mexico, or frankly any country, in my view, can really expect to have strong growth if it doesn't have a good relationship with private sector companies, and again, respect the agreements that have been put into place. So, again, I think it's always a work in progress, but that message just seems very clear to me, and certainly we've been delivering it.
Thank you. I mean, especially at this time when we see that there is a little bit of a rebalancing going on in terms of supply chains from China, and there's a huge opportunity for Mexico right now if it's willing to take that opportunity.
Don't get me started on this. I mean, this is one of my big themes, that this is a moment that should be Mexico's moment to really step up to the plate and show why, particularly now with the new USMCA in place. I think if President Lopez Obrador and President Trump, both of whom were critical of the original free trade agreement, came around to embracing this agreement, I think that shows that there really is a broad consensus in both countries that, that this kind of North American economic cooperation helps everybody. And so we're in this for the long term together. That's why I am frankly so concerned about Mexico during this crisis not handling the supply chain issue well, because I think this is a moment when it could be really benefiting from the general realignment between the United States and China. And so, that certainly, for me at least, adds a sense of urgency to everything I'm doing to try to grease the skids here.
Thank you, Ambassador. I want to turn the microphone over to Luis Rubio, President of COMEXI, the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, to give some closing remarks. But let me just say once again, we're really, really grateful for you being here, Ambassador. We're really grateful to COMEXI for the cooperation. Thank you, Congresswoman Harman, for being with us. Luis Rubio.
Thanks, Duncan, and thank you, Jane, for hosting this. Thank you, Duncan, for moderating, and thank you, Ambassador, for being here. You've made a very strong point about why we need to get things right, and I think that's the critical point. Let me just make 3 quick points to emphasize what you just mentioned. First, we're in the throes of elections in both countries, a fact that will determine much of what each country does. On the US side, the election will provide candidate Trump with innumerable opportunities to exploit Mexico's idiosyncrasies and weaknesses. I wonder whether the USMCA will make a change this time around. And regardless of who wins in November, the two nations have endless need to maintain the relationship, especially the border functional. As the ambassador said, there cannot be a healthy US without a healthy Mexico. It's a single boat, and we have to work on that. The second point is that, that the ambassador already mentioned as well. On the Mexican side, the issue, I think, is how much the supply chains will have suffered after the virus stand down. Also, how much Mexico succeeds, whether it tries in a way to launch a process to attract manufacturing plants that have been moving away or want to move away from China. All of this in the context of a likely second outbreak in Mexico, this time in the most highly populated and dense parts of the large urban areas of particularly Mexico City, but of all the large cities. And finally, I'm concerned that just as the Americans have managed to turn the pandemic into a fighting match between left and right rather than a point of conversion, that there's an enormous incentive on the Mexican side to use the US as Mexico tended to use in the past as a way to divide Mexicans one against the other. So beyond the topics related to the election, once the pandemic is over, we'll go back to the issues that have been looming for some time, that we know about, and that the ambassador has been managing for the time he's been in Mexico, from 5G to trade with China, Venezuela, Central America, migration and security. This will inevitably return with the pandemic when the pandemic is over, and I don't think that there's anything that will stave that off. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Luis. Let me just say that we will continue working with COMEXI very, very closely. And Mr. Ambassador, we'd love to work closely with your team as well. If we can be of any assistance on helping with public health issues, pandemic response, whatever it is, that's what we're here for. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. And thank you to everybody for tuning in today. All the best.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Pleasure.